Okay, it's 10:02. We've got over 60 participants so far, so that's great. Thanks everyone for joining us today on this joint Western Power Distribution and Regen webinar. We're going to be discussing the future of distributed energy generation, demand and storage in the Southwest licence area. As a bit of background, Regen has been working with Western Power Distribution since around 2016 to produce the distribution future energy scenarios dataset and analysis. And this has been an evolving and changing process. The scenarios we've used have changed, the technologies we've looked at have changed, and each time we're looking to improve it with your feedback. And this is the first time we've run webinars for the consultation events for obvious reasons. And so if you do have feedback on those particular thoughts or what went well, do feed that back to us via email with contact details at the end. So Regen is a mission-led membership organisation, and what we do with this analysis is we create a bottom-up stakeholder-informed assessment that translates the national decarbonisation ambitions of a net zero future to create credible local regional scenarios for energy and for connections to Western Power Distribution's network. The scenarios that we produce and the scenario dataset that gets released forms part of a longer process with Western Power Distribution using it to assess where and when strategic network investment may take place, and you'll be hearing later on from Western Power what they do with the data. So today, the agenda for today is we'll be first of all hearing from Ollie Spink, Strategic Network Engineer for Western Power Distribution, and he'll be talking you through their approach to the net zero future energy scenarios work. Then you'll be hearing from Ben Robertson from Regen, discussing our modelling for the 2020 future energy scenarios and how we use key stakeholder feedback to inform our models and make sure that our projections are as realistic and as credible as possible. Secondly, Joe Noble, also from Regen, will speak about our assessment of new developments, which is a key area of analysis. That's for new homes and non-domestic developments too. Throughout this webinar, you'll have a chance to feed in questions, so that at the end, with what time we have left, we will be running a Q&A session. So do keep those questions feeding in throughout. And the way to do that for this webinar is to go to menti.com. So actually, I'll ask everyone to take out their phones and go to menti.com, and that'll be the way that you'll be able to feed in questions throughout this webinar. Also, we'll be asking polls and we'll be asking live questions to get your input in throughout. So it's quite important for us and for this process. So if you go to menti.com and type in the code on your screen, 297643. Lovely to see some people already doing that and giving us that thumbs up. So as you can see on your screen, if you go to menti.com and type in the code 297643, then you'll be able to interact with the polls, quizzes and live questions throughout, and also feed in questions that we will get to at the end. Any questions that we don't have time to get to, we will respond to offline, so feel free to leave contact details. Otherwise, Regen will be producing a summary document of these consultation webinars, showing what you've said and how it will influence our modelling to make the process as transparent as possible. So thanks to everyone that's signed up through menti.com so far, and great to see those thumbs up coming through. So as a first question to get you started and to show what kind of we can do. So were you aware of Western Power Distribution's future energy scenario process before today? Take a moment, menti.com, the code 297643. Got a lot of participants today, so we'll just wait a couple of minutes, give people a chance to go through those. That's really great. It's really great. The more people that are engaged with this, because we can get all the feedback that we need. Okay. So just wait another 10 seconds on that. Thanks everyone so much for filling out that so far. Okay, so we'll move on to the next slide. Another question. What do you want to get out of today? This is another multiple choice question. Have a read through that. Quite an interesting split. Hopefully those of you that answered no to the previous question of not having heard of the distribution future energy scenarios process before today will be able to answer yes for your next webinar. We're giving away some of the answers already, and 44% of you would like to understand more about the future energy scenarios process. So also we definitely hope to answer those and all of these options within this webinar. Real. That's really great to see so many people engaged. Just have another 10 seconds on that. Okay, so I'll now introduce Ollie Spink from Western Power Distribution to be talking through the Western Power network strategy for the Southwest net zero future energy scenarios.
Thank you very much, Frankie. Morning, everyone. Share my screen. Hopefully this works as well as it did last time. You were just checking you can see my screen there, Frankie. Yeah, perfect. So yeah, good morning, everyone. As Frankie said, I'm Ollie Spink. I'm a network strategy engineer for Western Power Distribution, largely responsible with project managing the distribution future energy scenarios from the Western Power side. So I work closely with the regen team here today. What I'm going to cover today in short 25 minutes or so is a quick summary of what are the distribution future energy scenarios, why are they necessary, why has Western Power started to use these, and I'll be dropping in a few, as we go along, some updates to our process for the 2020 edition of the DFES, where we've made some, what we like to think, improvements. And then finally, I will be just outlining what we use the DFES for in Western Power Distribution. So, without further ado, what are the distribution future energy scenarios? In a nutshell, it's a study that we do on a per license area basis, where we try to assess the future growth potential of demand and generation within a license area, and we try to spatially allocate where that could happen to see, as we transition towards a distribution system operator, this is an opportunity for Western Power to demonstrate that we understand the needs of our customers. That will be for now and in the future. And this exercise and the subsequent business processes that follow from it allow Western Power to demonstrate that we are understanding the needs of our customers and developing a distribution network to be able to accommodate those needs now and in the future. And it's worth mentioning there, I said energy rather than power, whereas traditionally for distribution networks have been designed very much to accommodate a peak power with a given level of security at a certain time. It's becoming more apparent that we need to understand more about the energy usage of our customers. This is with particular reference to where customers may be changing their traditional demand profiles as to what time of day or what potential day of the week they use their energy, and whether this could be used in a way to benefit the operation of the distribution network. So, as a quick potted history, as Frankie mentioned, we started this in 2016 with Regen, and Southwest was our first license area. It was a license area that had a remarkably high number of connections for distributed generation in the early part of the last decade, as it is now. And that was something that we wanted to capture and to see whether the growth of any potential new technologies and further growth of distributed generation, what impacts this would have on the Southwest network in the future. So it normally takes 2 years to do all 4 license areas, so 6 months per license area. So we've gone round this cycle twice now. So today is effectively the launch of our round 3 distribution future energy scenarios project. And new for 2020, we're actually accelerating this. So all 4 license areas will be done on an annual basis, which involves a fair bit more work for myself and for Regen, which we relish. And yeah, hopefully this will provide some benefit, because it, as I will explain shortly, it allows all license areas to be compared a bit more easily. So hopefully one question you may be asking yourself now is, what's the point of doing scenario-based planning? Why not just have one view of what the future is going to be and accept that that is the case? Well, something that we found traditionally, strategic planning for electricity networks is we would use extrapolation from historic trends of traditionally peak demand. And this was perfectly fine for a very long period of time when there was relatively little growth in the amount of customers connected to the distribution network and their usage. Whereas what we find ourselves now in is a bit more of an uncertain time. There are emerging demand types which are likely to connect to the electricity network, such as electric vehicles and heat pumps. Domestic air conditioning is another one of those. The continued growth of distributed generation, so the removal of large, traditionally fossil fuel burning power stations, and that generation mix in the UK being replaced with a lot more smaller capacity and largely renewable generation being connected to the distribution network, which obviously has an impact for us. In addition to this, there are the looming government targets to meet our greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, the net zero targets, and I'll be going into those in a bit more detail shortly. And all of this, when you add those aspects together, mean that the future of in the UK, and in particular how the distribution network topology will look, is very uncertain. And this kind of leads on to why we need scenario-based planning. There are different uptake potentials of different technologies, and we're trying to, by encompassing a range of different scenarios, assess whether the distribution network is capable to handle and deliver the power and energy we require for these different scenarios. So I think in summary, that slide, no one scenario will give us a true picture of what we expect to see in the future. So by using scenarios, a range, we can have almost an envelope of what we could expect to see. And from our point of view, as long as we fall within that envelope, then we will be designing a distribution network that is economic and efficient. So to introduce the future energy scenarios framework that we're working to 2050, ever since we started this process, we've aligned the future energy scenarios framework, which is published by National Grid system operator on a yearly basis. So they do a study, which you hopefully may have heard of, that looks at the UK need for energy out towards 2050. We found that it's a good opportunity for us to align with this, to follow a broad same framework, so that we're effectively speaking the same language as National Grid, and it's a clear message to send to consumers. This is broadly the same as what all of the distribution networks have worked towards now over the past couple of years. We've been working together to kind of standardize this process a bit more. So first, from a stakeholder perspective, it's easier, so that if you looked at our Western Power's Southwest distribution future energy scenarios and compared it to, for example, Electricity Northwest in the northwest of England, you would understand that they're speaking the same language and they're based on the same principles of this scenario framework. So to introduce the 2020 scenario framework, this is the first of the future energy scenarios that complies with our government targets of reaching net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And I will be going into more detail shortly as to how we use the DFES data and how we plan for the implications of this going forward. It's also important to note that the two axes there, so you've got the speed of decarbonisation on the x-axis and the level of societal change on the y-axis, and that's really how much we expect customers to change from their existing habits as to how they use electricity and gas in the future. So as a quick summary of the four scenarios, steady progression goes some way to reaching the net zero targets, but not all the way, and has a relatively low level of societal change. System transformation does reach our net zero targets by 2050, and this would be delivered through a range of solutions where customers don't expect to see that much change in how they use their energy. So as a quick example off the top of my head, this would be through using low carbon gas for heating rather than potential electrification, as this delivers a high grade of heating energy that is more akin to the current natural gas for heating purposes. The other one there, consumer transformation, that is broadly reaching our net zero compliant targets, but through a more kind of electrified pathway, I suppose, where you would expect to see more electrification of heat and a change in customer behaviour. And then the final one there, leading the way, that would be more of a more ambitious scenario where we try to reach the net zero targets before 2050. A quick update, where this is new for 2020 for the DFES, we have aligned to this year's 2020 scenario framework. So in the past, we would have aligned to the previous year's published scenario framework. So as an example, if we were to be following our previous process, this year's Western Power would be based on the FES 2019 scenario framework. And some of the feedback we got from stakeholders is that this is quite confusing because we're effectively almost a year behind, and that may not account for more up-to-date government targets or changes in the industry. So some of the work that we've done as an industry so far is to try and standardize so that we're using the same framework on the same year. So hopefully this will be more, it will show more consistency across our license areas and across all distribution networks. So the FES scenario framework will be published, or the FES scenarios more correctly, will be published in July of this year, and then Western Power will look to publish our DFES in the late part of 2020. So hopefully another question you may be asking yourself now is, what's the point of regional scenarios? Why, if there is a national picture, why do we not just use that? And the answer to that is that the future energy scenarios looks at the UK requirement for supply and demand for gas and electricity, but it's quite agnostic as to where that demand is actually, or generation growth is going to be located on the network. And we find as a network operator that is key to operating in an efficient and coordinated network. And hopefully this slide is a quick visualization of this. So this is using our most up-to-date DFES scenario projections as of November 2018. And these are, as a quick explanation, with a reference to a 2019 baseline, you've got the red demand growth figures there. So this is in comparison to a 2019 peak demand per license area. When we lay on our growth projections for demand technologies, and these are profiled for a typical winter peak demand day, this is the likely, or under the highest growth scenario, the potential increase in license area peak demand that we could expect to see by 2030. Similarly, for the green figures there for generation, that is based on the installed capacity per license area of generation that we currently have as of 2019, and then laying on our growth projections for different generation technologies, what this would look like by 2030. What this is attempting to demonstrate is that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to each of our license areas. They're very different in terms of geography, network topology, social, and industry. And we find that there are different solutions that would be required under the scenarios for various license areas. So by treating every license area in isolation, we're able to get a much more accurate picture, we feel, of what we expect to see happen in the next 15 to 20 years or so. That is why we feel that we are best placed as a network operator to use our local expertise and knowledge of the network and the area to be able to deliver this sort of this study. So as a quick explanation as to how we map these forecasts to our network, we developed, along with Regen's help, the concept of something called an electricity supply area. So this is an attempt to map or translate between the network-based data sets we have, which tell us about where our assets are, and various geographic data sets that Regen use to map socioeconomic and the distribution of electric vehicles or heat pumps across a licensed area. This is a methodology we use to create effectively a geographic area which represents a block of demand or generation as visible from the distribution network. So if you imagine the distribution network hierarchy as a pyramid, and what we do is we take every distribution substation and calculate an approximate footprint of what that covers, and then these are aggregated up depending on whether we want to look at the primary substation area that feeds all of the downstream distribution substations, or the next level of bulk supply point, or finally the top level of grid supply point. The level of electricity supply area we use is traditionally dictated by the level of detail of electrical analysis we want to do. So in round 1 and round 2, we've studied the in-depth, the 132 kV network in the southwest. So we were concentrated on aggregating our demand up to a bulk supply point level. So the picture there you can see on the left with fairly big polygons, that represents the 50 bulk supply points in the southwest, whereas in round 3, and I'm sure Ben will go into more detail about this shortly, we've gone down to a primary substation level and also broken this down further by local authority level and stakeholder feedback, as to it will be useful to also provide our scenario projections on a local authority level as well as a electricity supply area level. So we're doing for time, okay. Outputs, what we expect to see from this DFES process. The main use for Western Power is a very large data set that Regen provide, which contains a unique combination of the electricity supply area, and for round 3, when we consider all 4 license areas, it's about 3,000 or so. Different technology types that Ben will go through in more detail shortly, 4 scenarios and the years that we are forecasting. And we have a very large data set that then we are able to map this to our network model for detailed electrical analysis. In the past, we've also published a large report, as you can see the 4 there on the screen. We are slightly moving away from that this year for 2020, so the big report is gone and it will be replaced with the general methodology document as to the modelling process that Regen use, and then there will be a license area specific technology summary and a in5 document, and I'll be asking a question on Mentimeter through that shortly after the end of my presentation. So what do we actually use this data for in Western Power? So it's all well and good that we've got these growth projections as to what we think is going to happen in terms of the amount of customers connecting to our network, but how do we actually use this for our purposes? So the primary purpose of this was the shape and subtransmission study, which is effectively a detailed network review of the subtransmission, so 132 kV and 66 kV networks in a license area. This uses the DFES as a direct input, so we assign electrical behavior to each of our scenario projections for different technologies as to what we expect them to be doing at different cardinal points in the year that we want to study the effects on the network. We then overlay this onto a network model and run studies and effectively publish a very large report that says, under this scenario, we expect to see these areas of our network having potential constraints in a certain year, whereas in a, for example, slightly lower growth scenario, we may expect to see constraints, but they will be delayed by 4 or 5 years or so. So it allows us to have a bit of foresight and a bit of future planning as to if and when this demand growth or generation growth does appear on the network, these are the steps that we could take to solve it. In the past, we've also published a very large report on that. whereas it's something internally we've been discussing as to is there a better way for stakeholders to view this data, as it is quite a big document. So if you have read that and you do have any feedback as to how you would like to see that data displayed, then please do contact us. I think we've got some contact details shortly, and that will be much appreciated. Another slide here for what is the DFES used in WPD. So we have these 4 scenarios for each license area, and for some of our purposes where we require a single forecast of what we expect to happen, we create what's called a WPD best view, so kind of a single scenario, which is a combination of the 4 DFES scenarios. And this was done through a process to align with some Ofgem common scenario framework. So this was a working group that was set up in 2018 amongst all gas and electricity networks to come up with an industry-aligned position for a common view of what will happen in the future that Ofgem could use to benchmark business plans against one another between networks for comparative purposes. So we followed the same approach to map our DFES scenario projections to align with that common scenario, and then we apply some electrical behaviour and profile assumptions to create effectively percentage growth rates, and these are used for various parts of the business, such as our regulatory submissions. So you would see them, they feed their way into the long-term development statement, and then some other uses, such as our ongoing engagement with National Grid as part of the Week 24 process. And then also signposting and flexible power. So in the short term, we use our DFES scenario projections, so the pipeline to publish on our signposting and flexible power map areas where we may expect to see a network constraint in the future, and this is used to really gauge the appetite of customers in that region who would be willing to procure, for us to procure services from them to change their behaviour at a certain time of year to potentially alleviate a network constraint. So the signposting uses all 4 DFES scenarios and says this is this could happen in the future. Is there a market in the region to be able to deliver this service? The flexible power map is a single scenario, which is a lot more short term, so in the next 6 months or so, which is where we are actively procuring services to alleviate a potential constraint on the network. And I would look at our Western Power Maps Hub for more detail on that. The network flexibility map that should contain more information about the current position. And then finally, we have recently published our DFES scenario data. So this is the very large data set that I was talking about previously, that Frankie mentioned, on our website. So I'm going to very quickly show you a demonstration of this map. It was published about 6 weeks ago or so maybe you haven't had a chance to look at it yet, but if you can see here, there is a launch page when you follow the link on the previous slide, and then it comes up with this website, this map. You can see our 4 license areas there, and there's a list of drop options here on the left hand side where you can choose a license area, scenario, technology, sub-technology, and then a year, which corresponds to this slider at the top. So as a quick example, I will show you the Southwest for consumer power, and this shows, using the color scale at the bottom there, the proliferation of air conditioning units that we would expect to see by the end of 2020. You can also view this by local authority level, which is just effectively cutting up ESAs into the local authority areas rather than electricity supply areas, and this is useful to, hopefully will provide useful to stakeholders to see what we have projected in each of our license areas. And then one last point is the export data here at the top. Once you've chosen your options on the left hand side, you can click export data, and that will export as a CSV file, which you can use for more interrogation if you require. Hopefully that was a whistle-stop tour of distribution future energy scenarios from the Western Power side. If you've got any questions, then please do contact us using those details on that slide. I will be staying here for the rest of the webinar and happy to take questions at the end, so please do, when you have a question, feed it through Mentimeter. And I believe I have a couple of questions I'd like to ask you through Mentimeter, if that is possible. I think it's just being set up now. So yes, here we go. The stakeholder engagement from Western Power. I suppose one question we've had from various stakeholders in the past, and as an industry in general, is that potentially they may feel a bit over-engaged or oversaturated with information from us and National Grid and other networks, that maybe it becomes a bit confusing as to when we're all publishing our own scenarios and frameworks. So this is just a quick question to say, do you feel well engaged or under engaged in general as part of this work that we are doing? And hopefully that is that's a good wording there. Are you suffering from stakeholder fatigue or under engagement as part of this process? And that is a good answer. So thank you very much for answering those. This is the first time that I've used these questions, so I do find them quite useful as to get some. It's never as good as having the people in the room talking to them, but it's a really good opportunity in the current times to get some feedback as we're going along. So I think we've got one more question, if that's possible, on the next slide. So this is, as I mentioned earlier, the DFES, how we're going to publish this data this year. We're going to have in 5 minutes summary document per license area. We're going to have the large data set that will be published on the map on the website, the detailed methodology document, and then a technology specific summary for each license area as well, outlining the growth projections. So I suppose which one of those would be most useful to you? I'm not sure, having not used Mentimeter. Are you able to answer for more than one of those? Yeah. Well, hopefully that's a good thing then. Yeah. So that is interesting. It's something we find that the map will be useful, and it's always nice to see a short summary document as to this is what we expect to see, rather than leaping through a really large presentation or report. So yeah, thank you very much for answering all of those. I think that's everything from me. So I will pass back over to Ben Robertson, who's going to go over the regen modelling process. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ollie. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ben. I'm an analyst at Regen, and today I'll be talking about the analysis we do here in a bit more detail. And also during the presentation, I'll be asking you some questions about some of the factors we use in our modelling, so we can use your feedback to get a more accurate picture of the future of energy in the Southwest. So also, before I move on, just to mention that we will not be presenting any of the results from our modelling because we are quite early on in the process. We started a couple of weeks ago, and the process or the analysis will go on until the end of June. So you can always get in touch with us between now and then if you'd like to feed into the process, or if you have any questions. Our contact details will be up at the end. And also, as Frankie said earlier, if you have any questions during the presentation, just ask them on menti.com and we will address them at the end. So first, a bit of background, and this is going to repeat some of the things that Ollie's already said. So National Grid publish a document called Future Energy Scenarios every year, where they project 4 scenarios detailing the future of energy technologies out to 2050 at a national level. We then use these projections as a framework to project down to small specific areas on WPD's network called electricity supply areas, or ESAs as we call them, and I'll show you a map of those in a moment. Now, the analysis we do is largely informed by factors that are specific to an area, and the information we get from stakeholders such as yourselves helps us build or create those factors. So this is just an overview of the analysis we do, and it can essentially be split into 3 stages of the assessment we carry out. And we do this assessment for each technology we cover. So the first step is establishing a baseline, and this involves using WPD's connections database and other sources such as feed-in tariff or renewable obligation certificates to learn more about where technologies have been built in the past, and that helps us determine where they might go in the future. Then the next stage of the analysis is near-term growth, and that involves looking through the pipeline or the current projects in the planning system and using local factors to determine how much of those get built and in what scenario. And this will be the focus of today's session, where we'll talk about some of those factors and hopefully get your input. And then there's long-term growth, so that's looking at the future of energy beyond 2035, and for these we align more with national grids scenarios. So as Ollie showed earlier as well, these are the 4 FES scenarios we'll be using to inform our analysis. And the way we use them is we use them more as a starting point before applying local level factors to decide whether certain areas will get higher or lower deployment rates than the national average. I won't go into too much detail on these, but an important thing to mention is that the scenarios can change every year, which is another reason why it's important to make this DFES study an annual process so that WPD can have most up-to-date figures to inform their network planning in all of their license areas. So this is a map I mentioned earlier. It's a map showing the ESA, which are the grey outlined areas. And they relate to areas on WPD's electricity network that share the same supply points. So it's just to demonstrate, I guess, the level of granularity we'll be going to in our study. And also, as Ollie mentioned, they are divided into local authorities. And that is because a lot of the factors we use in distributing our technologies are at a local authority level, for example, local development plans or waste collection data. Now, for this round of DFES, also, we want to put more emphasis on local authority data, not only as a factor in our modelling, but also to report our projections once the study is completed. And that will feed into that nice interactive map that Ollie showed. Oh. Hang on a minute. Can you guys see a map? There it is, sorry about that. So this slide shows where baseline large-scale generators are in the southwest. Now, there's a lot going on on this map, but essentially it shows where large-scale generation is, what technology it is, and how close it is to the electricity network, shown by the green and orange lines. So as you can see, there's a lot of wind and solar scattered throughout the license area, especially solar, and especially in Cornwall, where it's quite dense. And there are also a few gas and diesel large-scale power plants nearer the more major towns and cities, so places like Plymouth, Exeter, Bristol, and Taunton there. Now, for each of these sites, we know exactly where and when they were built, and we can use this data, as I said before, to inform where future growth might grow. So speaking of future growth, here is a summary of the pipeline, which are sites that have a connection agreement but have not yet been built. So there's 530 megawatts of solar in the pipeline, over 45 megawatts of onshore wind, and interestingly, over 150 megawatts of gas-fired power. So it'll be interesting to find out from you guys later on, particularly from local authorities that have declared a climate emergency, whether you think there might be any upcoming planning restrictions for these generators. We've already seen an example of this. Late last year, it was East Devon District Council rejected plans for a 40 megawatt new gas-fired power plant due to its commitment to promote renewables. Now, unfortunately, we won't have time to go through every technology we're going to be covering in the study, but we've selected a few that we think are relevant to the Southwest. So we've selected onshore wind as a large-scale generation technology, and for domestic technologies, we've selected rooftop solar and heat pumps. So first up, onshore wind. And I'll remind you all at this point to have menti.com up, as I'll be putting up some questions for you to answer in this next part. So what did we learn last time? When we did the consultation event 2 years ago, we found that there was a lack of appetite for onshore wind, which meant few planning applications were coming through. And we also learned that growth in onshore wind is likely to come from small-scale community-owned wind projects. So we want to know if that's still the case, or whether subsidy-free business models might have changed people's opinions about onshore wind. So next, a bit of context, or the baseline of onshore wind so far in the southwest. So far there's been 330 megawatts of onshore wind installed, and most of the growth came between 2012 and 2016, back when subsidies were high. And as I mentioned before, we are looking more at local authority trends. So this graph shows the growth of onshore wind by local authority. And as you can see, Cornwall has the highest rate of deployment by almost double, and the same is the case for ground-mounted solar. Now, this is largely due to a combination of its size, good resource availability, and also good planning history, which also means that it won't necessarily receive the most amount of growth in the future, as other local authorities will start to loosen their planning restrictions around onshore wind. So this map shows where all of those connected sites are, and as we saw, lots of them are in Cornwall, and lots of them are also small scale below 1 megawatt wind farms, taking advantage of the generous feed-in tariff. And there are also a couple of larger scale onshore wind farms in North Devon. Now, in terms of the future of onshore wind, sites looking to connect in the pipeline, there are 5 onshore wind sites totaling a capacity of 48 megawatts in the pipeline, and all received a connection agreement quite recently in the last 2 years. So activity has shown to be picking up. Again, a problem. There we go. Just need to go back and forwards on the map ones. So this is where those pipeline projects are on a map, shown by the pink dots. And as you can see, they are located quite near existing onshore wind farms, which shows that these areas are quite favourable for onshore wind. And they're also quite spread out across the licence area, which is interesting to see. So subsidy-free onshore wind in the southwest, and the element of local ownership. So for this next part, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and we essentially want to know how you think these factors will influence the deployment of onshore wind in the near future in the southwest. So the first question I have for you guys is, under an ambitious scenario, when might onshore wind deployment pick up again? I'll give you a few moments to answer this one. Liking the decimal place, very accurate. Okay, got quite a few responses there, but obviously not everyone will have a view. So I'll move on to the next slide very shortly. Okay. So the second question I have for you is, where will subsidy-free business models lead? So what we know from our previous engagement with stakeholders is that subsidy-free business models favours large-scale wind farms. So we want to know what effect you think this will have on smaller sites, also bearing in mind that the feedback we got last time was that growth is likely to come from small-scale wind generation. Interesting. Okay, couple of large, so what we've seen in the past century, a couple of large sites and then lots of smaller scale sites. Very interesting. Thank you guys, and I'll make sure that's reflected in our modelling. So next up, we move on to rooftop solar on domestic buildings, which has had incredibly high rates of deployment in the past, and especially in the southwest. And going forward with the new smart export guarantee, falling installation costs and also increases in household demand brought about by heat pumps and EVs, we think that it still has a big role to play in the future of energy in the southwest. So this heat map shows the proportion of homes in each local authority with rooftop solar installed. There is quite a large range going across the licence area, but for the most part, each local authority is either amber or orange, which means that the average for the licence area is quite a high 6% of homes with rooftop solar, and that goes up to 10% in some areas, such as Torridge and Mid-Devon. So that's where the growth has been. And for this first question on rooftop solar, we want to know what factors you think are most important when determining where growth is likely to go. So you need to rank these factors in order of most important to least important. And we know from previous stakeholder engagement events that all these factors are important in determining, but for our modelling, we like to weight them more to get a more accurate view on rooftop solar. All right, I'll move on. Thank you, everyone. So rooftop solar and new builds. So for our analysis on domestic solar, we separate our projections into retrofit, so rooftop on existing buildings, and new builds, rooftop on new developments, because this can be an area of particularly high growth. So there's an online data set we use to get an approximate figure for installation rates on new builds, and that's called EPC data. But this data set is not complete for all areas of the UK, so we would really value your input on this next question, which is what proportion of new builds in your area are currently installing rooftop solar? Okay. Very interesting. All right, yeah. This will really help our modeling, so thank you everyone for participating. I'll move on in a few moments. Okay, great. So next on, we move on to heat pumps. And firstly, again, a bit of background. Heat pumps are installed in around 0.7% of homes in the southwest, and this compares to a national average of 0.4%, so quite a bit higher than the national average there. And the last point there, in a net zero scenario, the National Fez projects that 10% of homes will have a heat pump by 2030, which means that there could be lots of growth in the 2020s. And also just to make you aware of some of the policies and schemes that will affect the rollout of heat pumps in the near term. First one there, domestic RHI scheme is extended until March 2022. So this scheme has been going on for around 10 years and essentially helps fund the installation of a heat pump through payments over several years. So a customer looking to install a heat pump would have to pay the upfront costs themselves, which has been a bit of a barrier to heat pumps so far. Now the government has looked to address that in their new proposed replacement for it, something called a clean heat grant. And this looks to address the issue by funding or giving a grant for heat pumps at the start when it's first installed, so that this might remove a barrier for people looking to install a heat pump. So that will certainly affect the growth in the near term. And lastly, the new Future Homes Standard will mean that gas boilers are banned in new builds from 2025 onwards. So just on that last point, how might that 2025 Future Home Standard impact low carbon heating uptake in new builds? So will it mean that gas boilers continue to be installed right up until 2025, where they'll switch to other sources of electric or heat pump heating, or will gas boilers decrease gradually until 2025, where they're replaced by heat pumps? I'll give you a few more moments to answer that one. Okay, quite an even split. All right, very useful. Thank you, guys. And I'll move on to the next section. So another map for you. This one shows where there are high densities of homes connected to the gas grid, and where there are high densities of homes that are not connected to the gas grid, or off-gas homes. And the reason why this is important is because it informs our distribution of where heat pumps might be built. Obviously, off-gas homes would favour installing a heat pump, as it would save them a lot of money on their bills. So regionally, you can see lots more homes connected to the gas network in the northeast, in places like Bristol and Bath, whereas Cornwall and the southwest has more off-gas homes that might consider switching to a heat pump, which is a cheaper source of heat than other off-gas sources. So the next question is, in the near term, will heat pump uptake be limited to certain types of houses? So again, in our modelling, we assume that it's weighted quite heavily towards off-gas homes, but we want to know what the growth will look like in other areas too. And again, a few moments on that one. Okay. Very interesting. So most of you think that it will be mainly in off-gas homes, but also in other areas emerging as well. And that concludes heat pumps. I'll move on to the next section, and the last section that I want to talk about is local planning and the different strategies that are being developed by councils and other institutions to combat climate change. I think I've seen a few of these comments already in the Q&A. So as part of this study, we do scan through local plans and engage with local authorities to find out more about what is being done in the local area. And there is quite a lot being done. In the last year, over 2/3 of local authorities in the UK have declared a climate emergency, as well as a range of other towns and parish councils, as you can see here on this map. And each are coming up with their own unique ways to achieve net zero, and we want to try to include that in our modelling. So my next question is, what changes will climate emergency declarations bring about? So that You can select up to 3 of these options, 3 that you think will be the most popular strategies. And if you feel that there's any been missed out, you can post it in the Q&A and we can look into it after. And a few moments to decide on this one. And a reminder, if you have any questions, just post them in the Q&A and we will get to them at the end. Great, I think I'll move on now. So my last question to you, and this is an open-ended question, you can post as many times as you like, is are there any specific documents or plans you would direct us towards that you feel should feed into our assumptions? So we know there are lots of examples out there. I've already mentioned East Devon's refusal of a gas power plant. There's also Bristol City Council heat networks, which I've seen there looking to switch on gas homes away from gas. We know about the Eden Project geothermal plant and various local plans and climate change action plans. And I'll give you a few more moments on this one. Brilliant, lots of responses. Just a little bit longer, 30 seconds. Great, thank you everyone for responding and for participating. That concludes my part of the presentation. And I'll now hand over to my colleague, Joe Noble, who will talk to you about our new development study.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ben. That was very interesting. So my name's Joe. I'm a graduate analyst at Regen, and I'm going to talk you through our new development study. I'm going to tell you a bit about our methodology, show you some preliminary results, and also ask you a question or two. Don't worry, this image isn't taken from a development in the southwest. It's a stock image. So to begin with, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of the study that we're doing. The aim of this study is to assess the scale and spread of new developments in the southwest and the other licence areas. And we do this by liaising with local authorities, planning policy teams to gather all of their most recent trajectories and development plans. And this is really important to inform WPD of the future network requirements so that they can ensure sufficient network capacity for all the demand and generation that is planned, to prevent the network being a barrier to a net zero future. And just to begin, I wanted to give you an example, which I think shows the usefulness of this study and how important it is. So this is a development planned near Plymouth called Woolwell Urban Extension for 2,000 new homes, a new primary school and other appropriate local facilities. And they also said in the plan that they aim to maximise opportunities for on-site energy generation. Now this is going to have a huge impact on the network. So it's really important that WPD know that this is going to happen, and also know how quickly it will come online so that they can make upgrades to their network as appropriate. So I'm just going to tell you quickly about our process for the new development study. And in the past couple of years, we have been, as I said, liaising with local authorities to collect local plans and other development documents. So that has meant we've researched these documents and then collected up the data into a big database. And now we're sort of modernising our process a little bit to use an online portal. So we share the currently held data with local authorities alongside a survey about local energy plans. And then we invite them to update this data themselves and then complete the survey. And we found that this gives us much more up-to-date data and also prevents local authorities having to verify the same set of data every time. So that's a new thing we've brought into this round. And then once we've collected up our data, we then assign each site to a local electricity area called an ESA, or electricity supply area. And that's really important to assess the spread of development to WPD. And then, as I said earlier, we assess the spread and the growth. So the last step is to produce scenarios, high, medium and low scenarios of how much development we think there will be in the domestic and the non-domestic sectors. So last thing to note is that this is an annual process. We update it every year. So don't worry if you have new data throughout the year, we'll collect it next time. So yeah, it's a rolling process. So just to tell you a bit about the data we collect. We collect all domestic sites over 20 homes and all non-domestic sites over 0.1 hectares. And the reason we don't collect the smaller sites is because it would mean a lot more work for local authorities, and actually you don't lose a lot of the accuracy by having a cut-off of smaller sites. And then the type of data we collect for these sites is obviously the scale, so the number of dwellings, the area and the trajectory of that if available. Geographical data is great for us to assess the spread. And then also for non-domestic, a very important point is that we need the category and the floor space, mainly category. So you can imagine that a library in the southwest would have a very different demand to, say, a pottery. So it's really important that we have as much information as possible about the new developments so that we can feed that into the modelling. And then finally, local authorities, if you provide us with source information, this is great, because then we can fill in any gaps that we miss or that we don't have. So now I'm just going to tell you a bit about the different data sources that we use. Sorry about that. So in the past, we've collected data from many sources. So local authorities tend to share local development plans, which are often updated annually, which is really useful to get an up-to-date picture. And also employment and housing land availability assessment and 5-year housing land supply statement. So all of these data sources sort of feed into our evidence base and give us a really complete picture of the new developments in each licence area, and also give us an idea of local energy plans. So now I'm just going to show you a quick example of how we assign sites to local distribution networks or electricity supply areas. And these are the areas served by a primary supply station or substation. So here you can see a map of Cornwall. I chose Cornwall because they have a very high number of developments. And this shows how we assign each development to an ESA. We essentially map them all out and then collect them up into each ESA. And this forms part of the data set which we provide to WPD. So now I'm just going to tell you a little bit about how we create the growth scenarios. So I've just told you about how we assess the spread of developments, but it's also important that we work out how much or how many dwellings or how much floor space will come online within the study period. So the first thing we do, as I said earlier, so I'm going to give you examples for the domestic process. So we have a threshold of 20 homes, and it's really important that we capture all homes. So we have to work out how many homes we haven't captured in that 20 home criteria. But for the Southwest, luckily it's only 2% of homes that aren't captured in that 20% criteria, and we calculated this using previous data. But it means a 32% in site reduction. So that's 32% less sites that local authorities have to process and send to us. So we think that by narrowing down the criteria, it makes it a lot easier for local authorities, and hopefully will give us a better data and be able to have more impact. So the next thing we do is analyze historic growth in the region. So this is a graph of net additional dwellings in the Southwest licence area from 2001 to 2018. And we use this to work out we use it to work out sort of baselines for low, medium and high growth, so that we can sort of base our growth scenarios on these. So the next thing to do is to use the trajectories that we already have. Sorry, I think your screen's gone blank there. I'm just going to get the slide back. So the next thing we do is we use the trajectories that we collect from local authorities alongside the historic growth in the region and other evidence that we've collected to create these growth scenarios. And when we're using trajectories to create growth scenarios, it's really important to think about the certainty of each site's build out. So more imminent sites are more certain to go ahead. Often they have planning permission, but also in the higher growth scenarios, sites are more likely to go ahead. So this allows us to say that more domestic developments will be built on schedule in the high growth scenarios and in more imminent years. And this is how we sort of spread or distribute the trajectories that we collect for each scenario across the plan period. So I've got a question for you now. I know some of you might have a little bit of Menti fatigue at this point, but it'd be really useful to get your input on such a topical question. So what do you think the magnitude of the lapse in build rates will be due to COVID-19? So I believe the government has just said that construction workers can go back to work, but they will be working under social distancing measures. So it'd be really useful to get some impact as to what you think the impact of COVID-19 will be in the different years, so 2020, 2021 and 2022. The right hand side is 50% reduction, so full slider is 50% reduction, and the left hand side is no reduction. So please slide your sliders as appropriate and submit when you are ready. I'll just give you a few more moments to fill that out. Brilliant. Looks like we're getting a lot of responses now, and this is actually reflecting what we'd expected. So at Regen, we think that obviously coronavirus will have a big impact on build rates, but they will bounce back over the next few years. And this feedback will be fed directly into our modelling for the new developments process and will impact how we delay developments in each growth scenario. So I'm going to close that question now and tell you a little bit about some preliminary results. So I've got a heat map of the domestic developments in the southwest with some of the largest sites plotted. So the blue circles are the big sites, bigger circles mean bigger sites, and then each local authority is colour coded. So darker reds have more homes planned in the plan period, and lighter ones have lower homes planned. And unfortunately, there are a few which we don't have data for yet, as this is an ongoing process. So interestingly, most of the large developments seem to be clustered around the M5, and as an extension of that, the A38, so the ones around Plymouth and below Exeter are on or around the A38. So it seems that larger sites tend to be built where there is good transport infrastructure. And another interesting point is that Cornwall doesn't have any of the largest sites, but it has the most developments out of all the local authorities. So this suggests that in Cornwall, developments tend to be smaller and more distributed, which is really important data for WPD to know about so that they can plan their network accordingly. So now I'm just going to tell you a bit about what we plan to get out of this study and what it will feed into. So I've told you already that WPD will use it to model the growth in underlying electricity demand. And Ollie mentioned earlier how important this is to understand future energy requirements. And WPD will map the data set to their network model for analysis. We also use it, apply it to our disruptive demand models, so heat pumps, rooftop solar PV, home batteries. We use the new developments in each electricity supply area as a sort of distribution factors so that we can get an idea of how many heat pumps there might be in a certain electricity supply area, for example. And then finally, as a result of your feedback from this webinar and from talking to local authorities, we're able to incorporate local planning policy for new homes and also gather feedback on local energy policy. So we can feed this in to apply where there might be heat networks, for example, and take into account things like clean air zones. So that's obviously a big, has a big impact on demand in different areas, and perhaps how many people might buy EVs. So just final point from me. As I said, the study is still going on. We have extended the cutoff date to the end of May. So if you're a local authority and you haven't yet had an email from us or had chance to update your details on our portal, then please get in touch via the email on the screen there, or write in the Q&A if you want us to get in touch with you. And we've also included a survey on local energy policy in the email, so please fill that out too. Last thing to note is that this is a yearly process, so if you don't give us your most up-to-date data now because you don't have it yet, don't worry, you can give us that next year because it's constantly evolving. So finally, I'm just going to invite you to leave some thoughts and comments in the Q&A because we will be shortly going to a Q&A section of the webinar, and I will pass you over to Ollie to talk about some of the next steps.
Thank you very much, Joe. So yes, thank you all for your ongoing participation. Hopefully you found Mentimeter a useful vehicle to try and answer some questions that Regen have had, and I've definitely found it useful to see the responses come in, and thank you for so many of you that have responded. Yeah, just a couple of next steps. Publication timelines. We plan to publish the DFES data and subsequent documents in the late part of 2020, so expect it kind of November, December time. The future energy scenario, so the National Grid UK-wide document, will be published in July of this year. So if you have any further collaboration, please do feel free to contact me or WPD Networks using that email address there, or any of the Regen team, who would be more than happy to answer any queries. I think we've got quite a few questions that have come through, so we're gonna answer a few of them, but I think we'll also try and publish those and see if we can put some responses to those questions and publish that as part of the dissemination after this webinar, if we don't get time to answer everything. So I think Frankie's got some questions to ask, if that's right.
Yes, reiterate, thanks again everyone for feeding in questions throughout this presentation, for attending the webinar, and for answering the polls and questions through menti.com. It's been really great to see the participation and the questions feeding in through. The slides will be available to all attendees, so we'll send that out with the agenda and delegate list to all attendees shortly afterwards. Also, just a very short survey about anything, how you found this webinar, and anything that could be improved, as we're always looking to improve the process of stakeholder consultation and get your guys' views on board. So yes, lots of questions through. Some there for Ollie from Western Power. So there's a question about Project Rapid, and perhaps you can give some more detail on that in terms of that's relation to electric vehicle chargers. Also a question about one of the maps that didn't seem to include Hinkley Point in terms of generation. There was a question earlier on about heat pumps and whether the idea of heat pumps was supposed to reduce demand, and why they're a concern for consumption in the future. I'll just answer that one quickly. So from a network perspective, it's not just the uptake of heat pumps, but it is the domestic heating technology that they replace. So a home might have electric storage, night storage heaters at the moment, and therefore have a particular demand profile. Them getting a heat pump is a different impact to the electricity network than a home which is on gas and has a gas boiler. So although heat pumps are more efficient than gas boilers and electric storage heaters, going from a gas boiler to a heat pump will increase your electricity demand, although it will, for obvious reasons, decrease your gas demand. Ollie, perhaps you can give the Western Power perspective on that while you answer the questions about covering Project Rapid for rapid electric vehicle charger deployment.
Yeah, thank you, Frankie. I think, yeah, it very much depends on what heating technology a heat pump is replacing. And the other point I would add to that is that whilst they're highly efficient at kind of moderate ambient temperatures, as the ambient does fall, the efficiency of the heat pumps does decrease, and this can have a high power consumption at a traditional time of where we would expect to see peak demand on the electricity network, which tends to be kind of a cold winter day. So it has the potential to increase peak demand at times of existing peak demand. Yeah, just picking up on a couple of other questions. The map not including Hinkley Point, so that is a good point. We have something we had in the South Wales webinar earlier on this week as well. This map only includes distribution, connected, generation, and demand that is connected, or that we expect to see at kind of aggregated up to the 33 kV level. So this does not include any transmission connected demand. So Hinkley Point you will not see there. Similar Langage power station down in the southwest, but it also does not include any 132 kV connected generation sites on the map. So yeah, just as a point of note if you are looking for those. The project Rapid, for rapid charger deployment within motorway service stations on major roads. This is part of the government. It was announced in the budget of March this year, I believe, that the government has a £500 million fund for developing a charging infrastructure along the kind of the trunk road network of the UK. And as part of this, they expect to see, sorry, just looking at some high level figures, the government is currently a driver is never more than 25 miles away from a rapid charge point anywhere along England's motorways and major A roads. And they would like to see that increase in the future. From the perspective of our DFES studies, it's something in the past we have covered electric vehicles by projecting the number of vehicles that we expect to see registered within our license area. And the reason for that is that it's relatively simple to model the demand profile from an electricity point of view as to what the vehicles are doing, calculated based on the mileage and what they're doing, whether they're charging domestically at a certain time. But it's becoming more apparent that we also need to model the deployment of chargers as well as vehicles, because whilst the vehicles tell you how many cars or vans or etc. are going to be registered in your license area, it's actually the chargers that have the impact on the distribution network as to when and where they're being used. So I suppose an improvement that we've made for 2020 DFES is including, as well as the number of vehicles that we expect to see registered, the number of chargers that we expect to see that energy being delivered, and this will be split out by domestic charging, kind of a destination, whether that be a supermarket, etc., and also en route. So that would cover your motorway service area and various other charging kind of solutions, I guess. So I suppose in answer to the question, how are we covering rapid and rapid chargers at motorway service areas? By improving our process to include the number of chargers as well as the number of vehicles that we're projecting. I'd like to think that we've got that area covered. And there is work going on at the moment with Western Power and all other networks through the Energy Networks Association to look at the deployment of motorway service area charging. So have I answered all of those, Frankie? Is there any more?
Yeah, thanks, Ollie. We've also got a couple of questions about storage technologies. So far, the storage technologies we look at is just lithium-ion battery storage technologies, but we're always interested in the views from the industry, and we have consulted with industry in the past, the kind of potential uptake of flow batteries or other types of energy storage. So if you have particular views on that and you want to feed those in, the contact details will be in the slides that we send around, so please do get in touch. That's in the previous data sets, if you're looking, it's only lithium-ion battery storage that is included so far. We also got a question about low carbon heat and why we'd only focused on heat pumps. So that was in the section that Ben was speaking about. So perhaps Ben, we wanted to talk about the difference in the scenarios of heat pumps and hydrogen.
Thanks, Frankie. Yeah, I think I saw two questions about low carbon heat. One was about the future home standard, so I'd like to address that one first. So in a net zero scenario, we make the assumption that the future home standard does pass, and gas boilers will be banned in new builds from 2025 onwards. But obviously there's a steady progression scenario which assumes that, which may not assume that it passes, in which case gas boilers may continue to grow there. And the other question about H2 and the simple replacement of boilers to be H2. So our heat model does look at all heating technologies, but when considering the near-term growth for the southwest, which has a lot of off-gas areas, the focus is mainly on heat pumps. In a high hydrogen scenario, you might see hydrogen conversion coming about in the 2030s, so medium, longer term. So the short answer is yes, we do consider it.
Great, thanks, Ben. Also, some really useful comments from questions from people just expanding on the answers they've given. So I won't be bringing them up now, but very much thank you to those who've been providing a bit more detail, especially some of the local authorities. And yes, I'm sure this is right, Joe, that we will be getting in touch with every local authority, those that haven't yet responded to our surveys, but we have been getting really positive responses from that. So thanks again. To all of those. Another question about whether we'll be circulating the list of policies and the open-ended question at the end of Ben's presentation. And yes, the slides that we'll send around will include those answers. So there's another question about electric vehicles, and then one more potentially for you, Ollie from Western Power. Does any of this estimate the cost of meeting these projections? The electric vehicle question about the government currently consulting on bringing forward the date for ending petrol and diesel sales. So it used to be 2040, they've brought it forward to 2035. What looks likely is that electric vehicle uptake will surpass this. A lot of the projections, especially under the National Grid projections, but other ones show very high uptake of electric vehicles in 2030 and early 2030s. Obviously, the sooner the better in a sense. However, there are some limiting factors, sooner the better from a carbon perspective, limiting factors such as availability of lithium ion and the actual supply chain as it is. Wouldn't necessarily expect, even if the ban was brought forward, to see a massive change in the next few years, because the supply chain constraints we see reducing the uptake of electric vehicles. However, definitely we would welcome ending that ban earlier, but under the net zero scenarios, then we'll take into account whichever ban is in place when we are doing the analysis. Ollie, there's that question about, does any of this estimate the cost of meeting these projections?
Yes, thank you. I suppose the DFES is the first step in a process which Western Power do. So the DFES tells us about the number of effectively customer assets that we expect to see connected to our network, and then when we apply the behaviour that we expect these customers to be doing to be able to plan our network strategically, this gives us effectively pinch points where we may expect to see network constraints that would have to be reinforced, and then at that point those are looked at through a kind of a traditional lens as to what would the most cost-effective conventional reinforcement that would be. So whether that be uprating grid transformers or reconductoring an overhead line, or whether, at least in the short term, we can potentially defer some of that reinforcement by using customer procured flexibility. And that kind of cost benefit analysis needs to be done by us internally to work out what is the most cost effective solution. So I suppose the DFES in itself does not estimate the cost of meeting any of these projections, but the subsequent analysis that Western Power do then takes into account the cost of providing any network reinforcements to meet these solutions, and then the cost benefit analysis is done to work out the most cost effective solution. So hopefully that answers that question.
Thanks very much, Ollie. We've also got further questions about circulating the responses to the polls throughout this through menti.com, and yes, they will be circulated. We'll also be producing a summary report for these webinars to increase transparency, so all the responses we get and then how we're taking those away and taking them into our modelling assumptions and levers. So look out for that afterwards, once we've had a chance to input this into the models. Give one more chance for questions to filter through. However, I'm aware it is 11:30 now. Any questions you also want to do, and you think of after the webinar, then get in contact via the email address, either through to Western Power or to the applicable regen person. The contact details are on the slides. So thanks everyone for those questions. I think we'll leave it there. We will be reading through all of the questions that you've submitted and comments, useful links to your documents. So thanks very much for that. Thank you again ever so much, everyone, for participating. It's been really informative and insightful. And I think we'll end the webinar there. So thank you very much again from Regen and Western Power Distribution.
Thank you.